Okay, so you probably don't need to take notes on this part. Maybe just listen. So late at night when I'm trying to sleep and I'm staring at the ceiling, I try to wrap my head around a good way to kind of explain this or kind of understand it in like a holistic view, right? So I'm just going to walk you through how I understand the cardiovascular system, and maybe that will help you going forward. So the way the way I think about it is that the heart is two separate pumps, all right, and they work in unison. If the cardiovascular system was a simple pipe system, then everything you pumped out of one side would just return to the other side. But it's not like that. It's a very dynamic process. So I talk about the right heart versus the left heart, two separate systems working separately, but they work in unison, right? So whatever happens on one, the other can compensate. Now, I like to think of it like this because when you start breaking down the different pathologies, when you break down the Guyton cross plots, when you even look at the math, whatever happens on the left side doesn't necessarily correlate to the right side. They're independent of each other's. So think of them as a marriage, right? They're two separate entities, but they work together to get the same job done. So the left heart, let's talk about it. It's the powerhouse, right? It's very thick in musculature, and its job is the pumping action, right? It pumps to get blood to the systemic circulation, right? Its whole goal is to take the amount of blood necessary and get it to the organs so they could be oxygenated. Okay, so it's very strong. If you look at a cross section of gross anatomy of it, you'll see that the myocardium is much thicker. Okay, now when you get to the right heart, it's more delicate. Okay, it doesn't pump at the same pressures. Now, the immediate question you ask is, well, if it's delicate and it's not pumping with the same pressures, how can it compensate for the same amount of blood going from the left heart to the right heart? And this is the analogy I like to use. Think of the blood as a big river, right? And if you think of a big river, as you break it down into smaller rivers and smaller tributaries and streams, the pressure goes down, right? You still have the same amount of water in those small streams as you did in the big river. It's just a lower pressure system, right? As it branches apart. And that's what happens in the lungs. You take all this volume and you branch it throughout the lungs, right? And so that pressure dissipates. So whereas the left heart is pumping at basically your blood pressure, right? 120/80, the right heart's only pumping at like 25, okay? And the way it's able to do that is by this branching pattern. So that helps me think of it. And it's important to be able to do that because you don't want a high pressure system in the lungs. You want it to be low pressure. You want it to get very finite, right? So single cells, red blood cells passing through these small little arteries so that the alveoli, the oxygen can be transferred, okay? So that's the idea there. That's how the right heart and left heart work together. And being that it's like that, one so strong, the left heart versus the right heart so delicate, the math is different, okay? But when I think the left heart, I think of mostly this pumping action, right? This forward flow. And when I think of the right heart, I think of a lot of returning to the heart. And that's what happens when you look at the Guyton cross plots. So we'll elaborate on that a little later. But you can see that if the left heart has problems pumping, the right heart can compensate by bringing more blood to the heart, okay? And the same is works in reverse. If you have a low blood volume getting to the heart on the right side, the left heart could pump stronger. So they can work together to optimize the same goal. Now, one huge concept that I want to point out is the idea, and we'll get into it a little later. This is just an intro, is the idea of preload versus afterload, okay? So preload, and you can define this in many different ways. Preload is the same thing as your end diastolic volume. It is the maximal amount of pressure in the ventricle before you start ejecting, okay? So that's an easy concept, right? The maximal point, right? So like if you blow up a balloon, the maximal amount of air in that balloon before you let all the air out, that's your preload. That's your end diastolic volume. Now, when you think of systole versus diastole, you could simply change the word around. So systole is ejection, okay? Diastole is filling. So if you say end diastolic volume, You can also say in filling volume, all right? So it's the maximal point of filling before you eject. Now, afterload is a little more complicated. So I'm going to just draw this out because it's so important clinically, because you will all see patients that have high blood pressure. You will all see patients that are in cardiac failure. So you'll have to understand this concept, but primarily this idea of hypertension or high blood pressure really works for afterload. So let's say this is the aorta, and this is more theoretical than anatomical, right? But let's say this is the left ventricle. All right. If I said in this aorta, you have hypertension, right? High blood pressure, then right through this area, that means it's very hard to pump blood from here into here, right? Because this pressure is high. That's high blood pressure. So what happens if you have high blood pressure? That means that left ventricle has to squeeze against a lot more resistance, right? So what happens? It's just like working out your muscles, just like working out, your biceps or whatever, right? This myocardium over here gets a lot thicker. Okay. Now y'all deal with the pathology a lot when y'all get to term 4, but you can imagine if the walls of the heart get too thick, then you can't fill it very well, right? The actual ventricle gets smaller, the area inside to fill it gets smaller, and that produces problems, okay? So this concept of afterload is very important. This is why your patients have to be on blood pressure medications. You have to monitor it because it's technically a silent disease, right? You really don't, you may get headaches, but you really don't get symptoms of hypertension until they show up clinically. Okay, so when we get to the Guyton cross plots, we'll talk about this compensation mechanism a little more, but I just want to elaborate a little more on the vasculature, right? So it's even more dynamic than just the right heart and left heart working together. You also have the vessels, right? So if you're working out, your vessels vasodilate to your muscles so that you can get oxygenation there. If you've just had a meal, the arteries and vessels will vasodilate to your gut so that you can digest. So it's always this dynamic process. Who needs blood more, right? Kidneys always are going to need blood. Your liver sometimes, gut sometimes. It depends, right? So it's always this dynamic process. But when you think about the math of it, once you pump out the left heart, get all the blood to the circulation, get it to the capillaries, you've really dissipated all of the pressure. Now, what's interesting and one of the more difficult, I really didn't learn this to med school. I was like, this is very you don't learn this in undergrad or whatever. But when you get to the venous system, right, we go through the capillaries, we got very mild flow, and then we get into the venous system. The venous system actually has pooling systems, right? So it's not like you can say whatever you pump out of the left heart goes through and then that amount is going to get back into the right heart. It basically just pumps through the left heart, through the capillaries, and gets to the pooling system in the veins, right? What does that mean? It basically means that the veins have valves, the larger veins have valves, and then there are pools of blood, right? So as the heart needs more blood, you can actually vasoconstrict the veins and those pools get smaller. So you can actually titrate or modulate the amount of blood going to the heart from the right side by modulating the size of the pools, right? If you need more blood to the heart, you shrink the pools and it goes back. So again, the math works out separately from the right heart and left heart, simply because they do independent processes, but they work together to keep the constant blood flow, okay? So we'll go over this again as we talk about it, but I think by separating them, a lot of the concepts, the more complex concepts, work out. So I hope that made sense for you guys.